When you think of royal children meeting tragic ends in medieval England, you probably picture dramatic battlefield deaths, noble martyrdom, or perhaps poison administered by scheming courtiers in shadowy palace corridors. But there were two young princes whose disappearance was so carefully orchestrated, so systematically erased from public memory, and so thoroughly covered up by those in power that the truth has remained buried for more than 5 centuries. In the summer of 1483, within the imposing stone walls of the Tower of London, 2 brothers aged just 12 and 9 years old vanished from history as completely as if they had never existed at all. Their names were Edward V, rightful King of England, and Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. These were not nameless peasant children who could disappear without notice. They were the sons of King Edward IV and Queen Elizabeth Woodville, born into the most visible and scrutinized family in England during one of the most turbulent periods in the nation's history. Edward had already been proclaimed king following his father's death, with his coronation planned and preparations underway. Richard held one of the most prestigious titles in the realm as Duke of York. Both boys had lived their entire lives in the public eye, surrounded by servants, tutors, guards, and courtiers who knew their faces intimately. Yet sometime between the late summer and early autumn of 1483, these 2 princes simply ceased to exist in any meaningful historical record. They stopped appearing at public functions. They stopped being seen in the Tower's gardens where visitors had previously observed them playing. Their servants stopped mentioning them in letters and documents. The extensive administrative machinery of medieval government, which normally recorded every detail of royal life, from meal expenses to clothing allowances, fell completely silent about their existence. The last confirmed sighting of the princes occurred during the summer of 1483, when they were still being seen occasionally in the Tower's grounds. But as the seasons changed and autumn arrived, even these fleeting glimpses ceased entirely. No official announcement was made about their deaths, no funeral was held, no mourning period was declared, no tomb was erected. The boys had simply vanished, as though they had been carefully erased from reality itself. This disappearance was not the result of accident, disease, or natural death. It was not a case of children wandering off and getting lost. It was not even a conventional royal murder, where bodies would eventually be discovered and proper burial rites conducted. Instead, what happened to Edward V and his younger brother represents something far more sinister and calculated. The princes were eliminated in such a way that their deaths could never be definitively proven, their bodies could never be conclusively identified, and their fate could never be completely resolved. The man responsible for their welfare, their imprisonment, and ultimately their disappearance was their own uncle, Richard of Gloucester, who had declared them illegitimate, seized the throne for himself, and become King Richard III. But the manner in which these children were removed from existence was so systematic, so thorough, and so carefully planned that it reveals a level of cold calculation that goes far beyond ordinary royal murder. This was not a crime of passion or a desperate act born from immediate political necessity. This was a methodical elimination carried out with the precision of a modern intelligence operation. What makes this case particularly chilling is the way it established a template for the complete erasure of inconvenient individuals that would influence governmental secrecy and institutional cover-ups for centuries to come. The techniques used to eliminate the princes and suppress evidence of their fate reveal sophisticated understanding of information control, witness management, and historical manipulation that rivals modern intelligence operations in its thoroughness and effectiveness. What you will discover about their final months of life will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval power, family loyalty, and the lengths to which ambitious men would go to secure a throne. The story of the princes in the tower is not simply a tale of two murdered children, but a window into a world where systematic deception, institutional cover-ups, and the complete rewriting of historical truth were tools of statecraft, wielded with deadly efficiency. The England that shaped Richard of Gloucester into the man who would systematically eliminate his own nephews was a realm convulsed by 30 years of the most vicious civil warfare in the nation's history, where family loyalty had been repeatedly shattered by political ambition, where children had learned to see relatives as potential threats rather than protectors, and where the very concept of legitimate royal authority had been questioned, challenged, and violently overthrown so many times that murder had become just another tool of political advancement. This was the world of the Wars of the Roses, a conflict that had already consumed the lives of kings, princes, nobles, and countless common soldiers in a seemingly endless cycle of revenge, betrayal, and bloodshed that had torn English society apart at its very foundations. Richard himself was born on October 2nd, 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, the 11th child and 4th surviving son of Richard Plantagenet, 3rd Duke of York, during one of the most dangerous periods for his family's political fortunes. His father was, at that time, engaged in a deadly struggle with the reigning monarch, King Henry VI, for control of the English crown, a conflict that would eventually cost the elder Richard his life and force his surviving children to live with the constant knowledge that their family's rise to power had been built on violence and would likely be maintained through more violence. The young Richard's formative years were spent in a household where political survival was the primary concern, where loyalty was a luxury that could be abandoned when circumstances demanded, and where the distinction between family member and political enemy could shift with bewildering speed depending on the needs of the moment. By the time he reached adolescence, Richard had already witnessed the execution of his father, the deaths of several siblings, and the rise of his eldest brother Edward to the throne through military conquest rather than peaceful inheritance. Edward IV's reign, which began when Richard was just 9 years old, provided the future king with a masterclass in the ruthless exercise of royal power and the systematic elimination of potential threats to dynastic security. The new king had gained his throne through warfare and would maintain it through constant vigilance, strategic marriage alliances, and the careful management of noble families who might pose challenges to his authority. Under Edward's rule, Richard learned that survival required not just political skill but also the willingness to destroy anyone who might threaten the family's position, regardless of blood relationships or personal affection. The lesson was reinforced repeatedly throughout Richard's youth and early adulthood. In 1478, their brother George, Duke of Clarence, was arrested, tried for treason, and executed on Edward's orders, officially by drowning in a butt of Malmsey wine. This execution was particularly significant for Richard because it demonstrated that even the closest family ties meant nothing when weighed against political necessity. If Edward could order the death of his own brother, then clearly no relationship was sacred when royal authority was at stake. The cultural environment that shaped Richard's understanding of power was one where systematic violence against family members was not only accepted but expected when political circumstances demanded it. Medieval chronicles are filled with examples of brothers killing brothers, fathers eliminating sons, and uncles disposing of nephews when dynastic interests required such actions. This normalization of familial murder created psychological frameworks that made it possible for individuals like Richard to view even young children as legitimate targets when their existence threatened political stability. Richard's personal development during these crucial years was shaped by his role as the youngest brother in a family where survival depended on proving one's usefulness to the reigning monarch. Unlike his older brothers, who had inherited substantial lands and titles by birthright, Richard had to earn his position through service, loyalty, and demonstrated competence. This created in him a particular psychological profile that would prove crucial to understanding his later actions. He was simultaneously completely devoted to his family's dynastic interests and utterly ruthless in pursuing those interests, regardless of personal cost. The northern territories that Edward granted to Richard as his sphere of influence provided him with practical experience in the exercise of absolute power over life and death. As the king's representative in Yorkshire and the surrounding regions, Richard learned to rule through a combination of personal charisma, administrative efficiency, and strategic violence. His household records from this period show a man who paid careful attention to detail, who cultivated loyal servants through generous rewards, and who dealt swiftly and decisively with any challenges to his authority. The marriages arranged for Richard further reinforced the lessons about the subordination of personal feelings to political necessity. His union with Anne Neville, daughter of the powerful Earl of Warwick, was purely a strategic alliance designed to secure control over vast northern estates and neutralize potential opposition from the Neville family. That Anne had previously been married to Edward of Westminster, son of the deposed Henry VI, and that her father had been responsible for temporarily driving Edward IV from the throne, were complications that were simply ignored in favor of the political advantages the marriage would bring. Perhaps most importantly, Richard's years of service to his brother had taught him the crucial importance of controlling information and managing public perception. Edward IV's reign had been marked by sophisticated propaganda efforts designed to present royal actions in the most favorable possible light, while discrediting potential rivals. Richard had observed firsthand how historical narratives could be shaped, how inconvenient facts could be suppressed, and how public opinion could be manipulated through careful control of official records and strategic distribution of alternative explanations for controversial events. The religious framework within which Richard operated provided additional justification for extreme measures taken in defense of dynastic interests. The medieval concept of divine right monarchy held that kings ruled by God's will and that challenges to royal authority were therefore challenges to divine order itself. This theological framework made it possible to present even the murder of family members as a form of religious duty, a necessary sacrifice to preserve the stability that God had entrusted to the royal house. By the time of Edward IV's death in April 1483, Richard had spent his entire adult life in an environment where systematic violence was the norm, where family loyalty was subordinated to political necessity, and where the elimination of threats was considered a mark of prudent governance rather than criminal behavior. These experiences had created in him the psychological framework necessary to view his young nephews not as beloved family members to be protected, but as political problems to be solved through the most efficient means available. The transformation of Richard of Gloucester from loyal uncle and Lord Protector into the architect of his nephew's destruction began almost immediately after Edward IV's unexpected death on April 9th. 1483, when the Duke found himself faced with a political landscape that threatened to strip him of power, influence, and possibly his life, unless he acted swiftly and decisively to reshape the rules of royal succession in his own favor. The speed with which Richard moved to consolidate control over the young king and neutralize potential opposition reveals a man who had already calculated the risks and benefits of various courses of action long before his brother's death created the opportunity to implement them. The immediate challenge facing Richard was the powerful position held by the Woodville family, led by Queen Elizabeth's brother Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, who controlled access to the 12-year-old Edward V and commanded significant military resources that could be deployed to protect the new king's interests. Rivers had been given responsibility for Edward's education and upbringing at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, a position that had allowed him to build strong personal relationships with the future king, while also establishing a network of loyal supporters who viewed themselves as protectors of the Woodville faction's interests. The Woodville family's rise to prominence through Elizabeth's marriage to Edward IV had created deep resentment among established noble families, who viewed them as upstart commoners who had gained influence through feminine wiles rather than ancient bloodlines or military service. This aristocratic hostility to the Woodvilles provided Richard with a ready-made constituency of supporters who were willing to see the family's downfall as a restoration of proper social order rather than a criminal conspiracy against the rightful king. Richard's first move in what would become a systematic campaign to eliminate all obstacles to his own advancement was the carefully planned interception of the young king's party as they travelled from Ludlow toward London for Edward's coronation. On April 30th, at Northampton, Richard engineered a seemingly friendly meeting with Earl Rivers and other Woodville supporters, using the pretext of coordinating their joint escort of the king to the capital. The cordiality of this initial encounter, including a shared dinner between Richard and Rivers, was designed to lull the Woodville faction into a false sense of security about the Duke's intentions. The following morning revealed the true nature of Richard's plan when Rivers, along with Richard Grey, the king's half-brother, and Thomas Vaughan, the king's chamberlain, were suddenly arrested on charges of treason against the Lord Protector. This action was carried out with military precision, suggesting that Richard had already positioned sufficient forces to overwhelm any resistance, while simultaneously ensuring that news of the arrests could not reach other Woodville supporters who might have organized opposition to his coup. The young Edward's reaction to seeing his closest advisors and relatives arrested provides crucial insight into both his own understanding of the political situation and Richard's growing willingness to traumatize his nephew in pursuit of political objectives. Contemporary accounts describe the 12-year-old king protesting the arrests and demanding explanations for the treatment of men he trusted and loved. Richard's response was to dismiss the boy's concerns, disperse the remainder of his entourage, and assume personal control over the king's movements and communications. This initial assertion of authority over Edward represented far more than a simple change in the personnel responsible for his care. Richard was systematically dismantling the network of relationships that had provided the young king with emotional support, political guidance, and potential protection against threats to his welfare. By isolating Edward from everyone who had previously influenced his decisions, Richard was creating the conditions necessary for implementing whatever final solution he had already begun to contemplate for the problem of his nephew's inconvenient claim to the throne. The decision to house Edward in the Tower of London, announced as a temporary measure to facilitate preparations for his coronation, was actually a crucial step in Richard's developing strategy for neutralizing the threat posed by the legitimate royal line. The Tower, despite its nominal status as a royal residence, was primarily a fortress designed to hold prisoners securely and prevent unauthorized communication with the outside world. By placing Edward within its walls, Richard was ensuring that the young king could be isolated completely from potential supporters, while appearing to maintain the fiction that normal coronation preparations were proceeding. The Tower of London in the 15th century was far more than a simple prison or royal residence. It was a complex of buildings that served as the administrative heart of royal power, housing the royal mint, the crown jewels, important state documents, and the machinery of government that controlled England's military and financial resources. By controlling access to the Tower, Richard was positioning himself at the center of the power structure that would allow him to reshape the entire political landscape according to his desires. The arrival of Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, at the Tower on June 16th represents the moment when Richard of Gloucester's plans shifted from political maneuvering to something much more sinister and irreversible. The 9-year-old Duke of York had been living in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with his mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, who had recognized the growing threat to her family and sought the protection traditionally afforded by church law. Richard's successful effort to extract the younger prince from sanctuary demonstrated both his growing confidence in his ability to manipulate legal and religious authorities, and his determination to bring both potential claimants to the throne under his direct control. The violation of sanctuary rights represented a particularly serious breach of medieval law and custom that demonstrated Richard's willingness to override even the most sacred protections when they stood in the way of his ambitions. The Church's traditional role as a refuge for those fleeing political persecution was so fundamental to medieval society that even the most powerful nobles normally hesitated to violate it directly. Richard's success in persuading church authorities to surrender the young duke revealed both his growing influence over religious institutions and his sophisticated understanding of the legal arguments that could be used to justify unprecedented actions. The propaganda campaign that accompanied these moves reveals Richard's sophisticated understanding of the importance of public perception in maintaining political legitimacy. Rather than simply arresting the princes and announcing his intention to claim the throne, Richard carefully constructed a legal framework that would justify his actions while making it difficult for opponents to organize effective resistance. The centerpiece of this campaign was the allegation that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid because of a previous pre-contract with Lady Eleanor Butler, thereby rendering all children of that union illegitimate and ineligible for the throne. The source of this allegation was Robert Stillington, Bishop of Bath and Wells, whose testimony about Edward's supposed bigamy provided the legal foundation for what would become known as the Titulus Regius, the parliamentary act that formally declared the princes illegitimate and transferred the crown to Richard. The timing of Stillington's revelation, coming just as Richard needed a legal pretext for displacing his nephews, has led many historians to question whether the bishop's testimony was genuine or whether he had been persuaded or coerced into supporting Richard's claims through promises of reward or threats of punishment. The sermon delivered by Ralph Shah at Paul's Cross on June 22nd, declaring the princes to be bastards and Richard the rightful king, represents a crucial escalation in the systematic destruction of the boys' position and prospects. This public denunciation was not simply a political statement, but also a form of psychological warfare designed to strip the princes of their identity as legitimate members of the royal family. By declaring them bastards in the most public forum possible, Richard was ensuring that even if they somehow survived the immediate crisis, they would face a lifetime of humiliation and legal challenges to any claims they might make to royal status. The speed with which Parliament ratified Richard's claims and formally declared him king on June 26th demonstrates the effectiveness of his campaign to present potential opponents with a series of fates accomplished that made resistance seem both futile and legally questionable. By the time anyone might have organized opposition to his usurpation, Richard had already secured control of the legitimate claimants, established a legal framework for his actions, and positioned himself as the rightful king, defending the realm against the illegitimate pretensions of bastard children. The reaction of the prince's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, to these rapidly unfolding events provides additional evidence of Richard's growing determination to eliminate any possibility of future challenge to his position. Rather than attempting to organize military resistance or appealing to foreign powers for support, the former queen chose to negotiate with Richard and eventually emerged from sanctuary to accept his assurances about her family's safety. This decision has puzzled historians for centuries, but it becomes more comprehensible when viewed as evidence that Elizabeth had already recognized the hopelessness of her children's situation and was attempting to save what remained of her family through accommodation rather than resistance. The systematic removal of the princes from public view during the summer of 1483 was accomplished through a carefully orchestrated series of changes in their living arrangements, their daily routines, and their contact with the outside world. Initially, they had been housed in relatively comfortable quarters and had been seen playing in the tower's gardens. Gradually, however, their movements became more restricted, their interactions with servants more limited, and their visibility to visitors increasingly rare. This process was designed to accustom the public to their absence, while providing Richard with the opportunity to make final preparations for whatever solution he had decided upon. The systematic destruction of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury during the late summer and early autumn of 1483 was carried out with a level of methodical precision that reveals not desperate improvisation, but careful long-term planning, as Richard of Gloucester implemented a solution so complete and irreversible that it would eliminate forever any possibility of challenge to his usurped throne, while ensuring that the truth about his nephew's fate could never be definitively proven or their deaths officially acknowledged. The boys were not simply killed in a moment of political panic, but were instead subjected to a gradual process of isolation, dehumanization, and ultimate elimination that was designed to erase them from history as completely as if they had never existed. The initial phase of this process involved the systematic removal of everyone who had previously been responsible for the prince's care, education, and protection. The servants who had accompanied Edward from Ludlow were dismissed and replaced with individuals who owed their positions directly to Richard's patronage. The tutors who had been responsible for the boys' education were reassigned to other duties. The guards, who had initially been tasked with their protection, were gradually replaced with men whose loyalty to Richard was absolute and whose discretion could be guaranteed through a combination of generous rewards and implicit threats. Dr. John Argentine, the physician who had been attending to Edward's health during this period, would later provide one of the most chilling contemporary accounts of the young king's final weeks. According to Argentine's testimony, Edward had become increasingly aware that death was approaching and had begun preparing for it through daily confession and penance, like a victim prepared for sacrifice. This description suggests that the 12-year-old boy had not only understood the hopelessness of his situation, but had also been deliberately subjected to psychological torture designed to break his spirit and ensure his compliance with whatever fate Richard had planned for him. The psychological torture inflicted on the princes during their final weeks reveals a level of calculated cruelty that extends far beyond the simple elimination of political opponents. Richard was not content merely to kill the boys. He was determined to break their spirits completely before ending their lives. This suggests a pathological need to dominate and humiliate his victims that goes beyond rational political calculation to reveal something deeply disturbing about his psychological makeup. The gradual restriction of the prince's movements within the tower was accomplished through a series of seemingly minor administrative changes that cumulatively transformed their residence from a comfortable royal household into a secure prison. Initially, they had been housed in the Garden Tower, later known as the Bloody Tower, where they could move freely within certain areas and had regular contact with servants and occasional visitors. Over time, however, their quarters were moved to increasingly secure locations within the complex, with their final residence being in the inner apartments of the White Tower, where access could be completely controlled and unauthorized communication prevented. The manipulation of information about the prince's health and activities during this period demonstrates Richard's sophisticated understanding of propaganda and public relations. Rather than simply announcing that the boys were ill or indisposed, his supporters carefully cultivated an atmosphere of uncertainty and speculation that made it difficult for anyone to determine their true condition. Rumors circulated about various ailments that might explain their absence from public functions, while official statements became increasingly vague about their daily activities and future plans. The role of Sir James Tyrrell in the prince's elimination has been the subject of intense historical debate, but the evidence suggests that he served as the primary coordinator of the operation, rather than simply as a hired assassin. Tyrrell was a trusted member of Richard's inner circle, who had been rewarded with various important positions throughout the kingdom, suggesting that his involvement in the prince's fate was seen as worthy of substantial compensation. His position as master of the henchmen, responsible for the young men and boys who served at court, would have provided him with both the expertise and the cover necessary to manage the complex logistics of the prince's disappearance. The method chosen for the prince's elimination reveals careful consideration of both practical and political factors that would minimize the risk of discovery while maximizing Richard's ability to deny responsibility if questions were raised. According to the account later provided by Thomas More, based on information that allegedly came from Tyrrell's own confession, the boys were smothered with pillows while they slept, a method that would leave no obvious wounds or signs of violence that might be discovered by future investigators. The selection of Miles Forrest and John Dighton as the actual executioners demonstrates Richard's careful attention to the psychological profiles of the men he chose for this crucial task. Forrest was already employed as one of the prince's attendants, making his presence in their quarters routine and unsuspicious. Dighton was described as a man of few scruples who could be relied upon to keep secrets. Both men were chosen not only for their willingness to commit murder, but also for their ability to maintain silence about their actions indefinitely. The timing of the murders was calculated to coincide with Richard's absence from London on a royal progress through the loyal Yorkist territories of the north, providing him with an alibi while ensuring that he would not be present to witness the actual implementation of his orders. This arrangement allowed Richard to maintain plausible deniability about the specific details of the prince's deaths, while ensuring that the deed would be carried out according to his instructions. The disposal of the prince's bodies reveals the same careful planning that characterized every other aspect of the operation. According to Moore's account, the initial burial was carried out hastily and secretly, with the bodies interred at the stair-foot, meekly deep in the ground under a great heap of stones. This temporary burial was designed to prevent discovery while allowing time for the implementation of more permanent arrangements for concealing the evidence of Richard's crime. The subsequent removal and reburial of the bodies in a secret location demonstrates Richard's recognition that the initial disposal had been inadequate for his long-term security needs. By ordering that the bodies be moved to an unknown location, Richard ensured that even if rumors about the prince's murders began to circulate, no physical evidence could be produced to confirm those allegations. This decision would prove crucial to Richard's ability to maintain public uncertainty about his nephew's fate throughout the remainder of his reign. The psychological impact of the murders on those who were involved in their planning and execution provides additional insight into the systematic nature of Richard's approach to eliminating potential opposition. Miles Forrest, according to Moore's account, died in misery at Saint-Thom, Martins-le-Grand, while John Dighton lived in great misery at Calais, suggesting that even the men who had carried out the actual killings were haunted by their participation in the crime. Sir James Tyrrell's later execution for treason in 1502 may have been motivated as much by Henry VII's desire to eliminate a witness to the prince's murders as by any genuine concern about his support for Yorkist pretenders. The complete absence of any official announcement about the prince's deaths, any funeral ceremonies, or any public mourning period demonstrates the extent to which Richard was committed to maintaining uncertainty about their fate. By refusing to acknowledge that the boys had died, Richard preserved his ability to claim that they were still alive if such claims became politically advantageous, while simultaneously making it impossible for opponents to organize support for their restoration or seek justice for their murders. The immediate aftermath of the prince's disappearance in the autumn of 1483 unleashed a cascade of consequences that would ultimately destroy Richard III's reign, reshape English politics for generations, and create one of history's most enduring mysteries through a systematic campaign of misdirection, historical revisionism, and institutional amnesia that was designed to protect the guilty while ensuring that the truth about two murdered children could never be definitively established or officially acknowledged. The speed with which Richard's enemies organized resistance to his rule, the international condemnation that followed reports of the boys' deaths, and the long-term efforts by successive governments to suppress evidence about the crime reveal the profound impact that this act of systematic child murder had on contemporary perceptions of royal authority and legitimate governance. The first major challenge to Richard's reign came in October 1483, just weeks after the princes had vanished from public view, when Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, launched a rebellion that was explicitly motivated by outrage over the treatment of Edward IV's sons. Buckingham had been one of Richard's most important supporters during his rise to power, making his sudden transformation into a rebel leader particularly damaging to the king's reputation and political position. The Duke's intimate knowledge of Richard's actions and motivations gave his accusations special credibility among nobles who might otherwise have dismissed rumors about the prince's fate as enemy propaganda. The timing of Buckingham's rebellion suggests that he had either witnessed evidence of the prince's murders or had been informed about them by participants in the crime who were beginning to have second thoughts about their involvement. The Duke's willingness to risk his life, his estates, and his family's future by challenging a king he had helped to create indicates that he had learned something about Richard's actions that he found morally unacceptable and politically unsustainable. His subsequent capture and execution eliminated a crucial witness to Richard's crimes, while simultaneously demonstrating the king's determination to silence anyone who might threaten his version of events. The emergence of Henry Tudor as the focal point for opposition to Richard's reign was directly connected to widespread belief that the rightful heirs to the throne had been murdered and that the usurper responsible for their deaths could never be accepted as a legitimate monarch. Henry's own claim to the throne was relatively weak, based on a complicated genealogy that traced his rights through his mother's Beaufort lineage, but the perception that Richard had committed an unforgivable crime against innocent children provided the moral authority that Henry's bloodline alone could not supply. The Christmas Day 1483 ceremony in Brittany, where Henry Tudor pledged to marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, represents a crucial moment in the development of the narrative that would eventually justify the Tudor conquest of England. By promising to unite the warring houses of York and Lancaster through marriage, Henry was implicitly acknowledging that the legitimate Yorkist line had been extinguished through Richard's criminal actions, and that only a dynastic union could heal the wounds inflicted by the murder of the princes. The international dimension of opposition to Richard's reign demonstrates the extent to which rumours about the prince's fate had damaged England's reputation throughout Europe, and provided foreign powers with justification for supporting challenges to his authority. The French court, in particular, used reports of the boys' murders as propaganda to encourage resistance to Richard and support for Henry Tudor's invasion plans. Guillaume de Rochefort's warning to the French Estates General in January 1484 about the need to protect their own young king from suffering the same fate as the English princes shows how quickly the story had spread beyond England's borders. The diplomatic implications of the prince's disappearance extended throughout the complex web of European royal relationships, as other monarchs began to question whether Richard could be trusted to honor treaties or maintain peaceful relationships when he had demonstrated such ruthlessness toward his own family members. The systematic child murder had transformed Richard from a potential ally into a diplomatic pariah whose actions threatened the stability of the entire European political system. The Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, was fought not simply between rival claimants to the English throne, but between competing versions of recent history and conflicting interpretations of royal legitimacy that had been shaped fundamentally by questions about the prince's disappearance. Richard's defeat and death in battle eliminated the primary architect of their elimination, while creating the opportunity for a completely new approach to managing the historical record and public memory of the events of 1483. Henry VII's accession to the throne created an immediate dilemma regarding how to handle the legacy of the prince's disappearance and the question of Richard's responsibility for their presumed deaths. On one hand, Henry needed to maintain the narrative that Richard had been a usurper and child murderer in order to justify his own rebellion and conquest. On the other hand, he also needed to avoid encouraging too much investigation into the specific details of the prince's fate, since such inquiry might uncover evidence that would complicate his own claims to legitimacy or raise uncomfortable questions about his supporters' possible involvement in the crime. The solution adopted by Henry's government was to establish Richard's guilt for the prince's deaths as an accepted historical fact, while simultaneously suppressing most of the documentary evidence that might allow future investigators to examine the case in detail. The Titulus Regius, the parliamentary act that had declared the princes illegitimate and provided the legal foundation for Richard's claim to the throne, was not simply repealed but was actively destroyed, with Henry ordering that all copies be burned and that anyone possessing copies be subject to fines and imprisonment. This systematic destruction of legal documents represents one of the most successful examples of institutional memory manipulation in English history. By eliminating the primary source that explained Richard's legal justification for his actions, Henry ensured that future historians would be unable to evaluate the merits of the case for illegitimacy or to understand the complex legal and political maneuvering that had preceded the prince's disappearance. The marriage of Henry VII to Elizabeth of York in January 1486 represented both the fulfillment of his Christmas Day promise and a crucial step in the process of rewriting the official history of the prince's disappearance. By marrying the sister of the murdered boys, Henry was symbolically restoring the honor of the Yorkist line, while also ensuring that any future investigations into their fate would necessarily involve questioning the legitimacy of his own wife and children. This arrangement created powerful incentives for the Tudor dynasty to maintain the narrative of Richard's guilt, while discouraging detailed examination of the evidence. The emergence of pretenders claiming to be one or both of the supposedly murdered princes created ongoing challenges for Henry's government and revealed the extent to which uncertainty about their fate continued to undermine confidence in the new dynasty's legitimacy. Lambert Simnel's claim to be Edward of Warwick, and later Perkin Warbeck's insistence that he was Richard of Shrewsbury, demonstrated that significant numbers of people remained unconvinced that both boys had actually died, and that some still hoped for the restoration of the legitimate Yorkist line. The psychological warfare involved in dealing with these pretenders required sophisticated propaganda campaigns designed to discredit their claims while avoiding detailed discussion of the evidence that might have supported them. Henry's government developed new techniques for managing public opinion and controlling historical narratives that would influence governmental approaches to information control for centuries to come. The execution of James Tyrrell in 1502 and the subsequent circulation of stories about his alleged confession to murdering the princes represents Henry VII's most significant attempt to resolve the uncertainty surrounding their fate, while simultaneously eliminating a potential witness whose testimony might complicate the official narrative. The timing of Tyrrell's execution, nearly 20 years after the prince's disappearance, suggests that Henry had decided to tie up loose ends that might otherwise cause problems for his son's eventual succession to the throne. Thomas More's composition of his History of King Richard III in the 1510s was undertaken at the request of Henry VIII's government as part of a broader effort to establish a definitive account of the prince's disappearance that would support the Tudor version of events while discouraging further investigation into alternative explanations. More's access to information from the families of the alleged murderers, including the sons of Miles Forrest, who were serving at Henry VIII's court, provided him with details that appeared to confirm Tyrrell's alleged confession, while actually serving to validate a narrative that the Tudor government needed to maintain for its own political purposes. The literary techniques employed by More in constructing his account reveal sophisticated understanding of how historical narratives could be shaped to serve contemporary political needs, while appearing to preserve objective historical truth. His dramatic dialogue and psychological insights created a compelling portrait of Richard as a monster, while making it difficult for readers to question the underlying assumptions about his guilt. The long-term suppression of alternative theories about the prince's fate was accomplished through a combination of official censorship, historical revisionism, and the systematic destruction of records that might support different interpretations of the evidence. Documents that might have provided information about the boy's final months were either destroyed or sequestered in royal archives, where they could not be accessed by independent investigators. Contemporary accounts that raised questions about the official narrative were dismissed as unreliable or treasonous, while new histories were commissioned that reinforced the Tudor interpretation of events. The discovery of bones in the Tower of London in 1674 and their subsequent reburial in Westminster Abbey as the remains of the princes represents the final stage in the process of transforming a historical mystery into an accepted fact through physical evidence that could never be definitively authenticated. The decision by Charles II to treat these bones as the prince's remains and to inter them with royal honours provided the Tudor narrative with seemingly objective confirmation, while actually creating a new layer of official validation for a story that had been developed for purely political purposes. The story of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury represents far more than a medieval murder mystery or a cautionary tale about the dangers of political ambition, standing instead as a watershed moment in the evolution of state power and the systematic elimination of inconvenient truths that reveals fundamental patterns in how institutions protect themselves from accountability while reshaping historical memory to serve the needs of those who control the mechanisms of official narrative creation. The prince's disappearance established precedents for the complete erasure of evidence, the manipulation of legal frameworks to justify atrocities, and the use of historical revisionism to transform crimes into accepted facts that would influence the development of royal power and governmental secrecy for centuries to come. The institutional mechanisms that enabled Richard III to eliminate his nephews so completely and to maintain uncertainty about their fate for so long demonstrate the extent to which medieval governmental structures were already capable of sophisticated information, control, and evidence suppression that rivals modern intelligence operations in its thoroughness and effectiveness. The coordination required to isolate the princes, manage public perception of their disappearance, eliminate witnesses, and maintain official silence about their fate reveals a level of systematic planning that contradicts simplistic narratives about medieval governance being crude or inefficient. The technical aspects of the cover-up operation, including the coordination of multiple agencies, the management of information flow, the elimination of witnesses, and the construction of alternative narratives, provide a template for understanding how modern governments and powerful institutions approach similar challenges when confronted with evidence of systematic wrongdoing. The methods pioneered in medieval England for suppressing inconvenient truths have been refined and expanded through technological advancement, but remain fundamentally similar in their basic approach and objectives. The psychological profile revealed by Richard's actions provides disturbing insights into the mindset of individuals who are capable of viewing family members as obstacles to be eliminated rather than relationships to be treasured, a perspective that reflects broader patterns in how power corrupts moral reasoning and transforms personal loyalties into political calculations. The systematic nature of his approach to the problem posed by his nephew's existence suggests that he had internalized a framework for decision-making that prioritized dynastic success over human life and institutional stability over individual welfare. The complicity of religious, legal, and political institutions in facilitating the prince's elimination demonstrates how quickly, supposedly, independent authorities can be co-opted or intimidated into supporting actions that violate their fundamental principles. When confronted with determined and ruthless leadership, the willingness of bishops to provide false testimony, of lawyers to construct spurious legal arguments, and of nobles to accept transparent fabrications, reveals the fragility of institutional integrity when faced with concentrated power and systematic pressure. The long-term success of efforts to suppress evidence about the prince's fate and to establish alternative narratives as accepted historical truth illustrates fundamental problems with how societies construct collective memory, and how easily historical records can be manipulated to serve the interests of those who control educational institutions, governmental archives, and cultural authorities. The transformation of what was essentially a criminal conspiracy into accepted historical fact demonstrates the power of institutional validation to override evidence and logical analysis. The continuing fascination with the prince's disappearance in popular culture, academic research, and public discourse reflects deeper anxieties about the vulnerability of innocence to systematic institutional power and the extent to which ordinary citizens can be protected from governments that are willing to eliminate inconvenient individuals through careful planning and methodical execution. The enduring appeal of this story demonstrates that questions about the relationship between power and accountability remain as relevant today as they were 5 centuries ago. The moral questions raised by the prince's elimination extend beyond the specific circumstances of their deaths to broader issues about the responsibility of institutions and individuals to protect vulnerable populations from systematic abuse and the extent to which ordinary citizens can rely on governmental authorities to prioritize human welfare over political convenience. The failure of contemporary institutions to prevent or adequately respond to the prince's disappearance reveals patterns of institutional weakness and moral compromise that remain relevant to understanding modern governmental failures. The story of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury ultimately stands as a permanent reminder that the systematic elimination of inconvenient truths and the institutional protection of powerful criminals are not modern phenomena, but represent enduring features of how power operates when it is freed from effective accountability mechanisms and moral constraints. Their disappearance established precedents for governmental secrecy and historical manipulation that continue to influence how institutions respond to evidence of systematic wrongdoing, while their memory serves as a continuing challenge to official narratives that prioritize political convenience over historical truth and institutional loyalty over human dignity. The techniques of information control, witness elimination, and narrative management pioneered in the case of the princes in the Tower have evolved and expanded over the centuries, but their fundamental principles remain disturbingly relevant to understanding how modern institutions approach the suppression of inconvenient truths. The systematic nature of the cover-up, the coordination between multiple agencies, and the long-term commitment to maintaining false narratives provide a template that has been adapted and refined by successive generations of those who wield institutional power without adequate accountability. The prince's story serves as both a historical warning and a contemporary challenge, reminding us that the capacity for systematic abuse of power exists in every society, and that the protection of vulnerable individuals requires constant vigilance against those who would sacrifice human dignity for political convenience. Their memory stands as a permanent indictment of systems that treat human beings as disposable obstacles to institutional objectives, while their silent testimony continues to challenge those who would reshape historical truth to serve contemporary political needs.